Hello everybody, I am Scott Tam, and thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to reflect a little bit about the Enlightenment in Spain and why we might want to appreciate it more. Now you might be asking, who cares about 18th century Spain? And what am I even doing here today? The sad truth is that the Spanish 18th century has historically been like the neglected stepchild of a backwoods family in the middle of nowhere. Very underrepresented, and it's still a real challenge to shed more light on such an interesting and meaningful period in Spanish history. It's too bad that the 1700s in Spain are still overlooked, marginalized, and misunderstood. To put it another way, if the 18th century had an Instagram page, it would probably have 4 followers. Me, my wife, one of my more accomplished students, and maybe like a fake follower. So, with that said, your time today is important, and I'm happy that you decided to stop by. I'm really looking forward to sharing my thoughts about my passion for the Spanish Enlightenment. And I'd also like to thank Drs. Luck and Kim for inviting me, and to Jorge for preparing this event, and to Drew for the camera work. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself, who I am, where I came from, and why I enjoy thinking about the Enlightenment, and how I connect to this intellectual period in Spanish history. I grew up in Southern California, near an 18th century Spanish mission, called the San Juan Capistrano Mission, where the swallows fly, from Argentina every March. They just arrived nested. I was an only child, and I remember spending much of my youth thinking about the Spanish mission and the Spanish colonists that lived basically in the same neighborhood that I lived 200 years before. Many of their trails and roads are still nearby my neighborhood today. I used to think about how they built the mission without blueprints and modern cement mixers, and how they constructed the roads and all the other logistical challenges that the Spanish colonists must have had in the late 18th century. Being an only child with working parents, I remember thinking a lot about what Spaniards must have had to struggle with without the modern tools and technology that we have today. I used to look at the street signs in my neighborhood, and I was surprised that almost every street name where I grew up had a Spanish name like, and these are all real names, Villa Conquista, Vista Grande, Del Obispo, Del Prado, Vista del Mar. All these names you can find on Google Maps in my neighborhood. Now, for you Spanish colonists out there listening, I grew up near the railroad tracks in Alta California. That's what it was referred to. So my natural attraction to 18th century Spanish culture and history is evident because it was all around me. Spanish culture and language seemed to be my calling because I had so many questions and so much curiosity about the people who lived in my neighborhood over 2 centuries earlier. And I remember asking when I was really young, hey, where'd they all go? But in addition to my curiosity for Spanish culture, I was also kind of an industrious kid because I enjoyed figuring things out on my own. For example, I enjoyed thinking of all the possible recipes you could imagine with peanut butter, bread, and celery. Or how can I fix a broken window before my parents come home? Without the proper tools, I used to think about how I could rely on myself to fix problems with no manual, no instructions. I remember building my own skateboard with basic tools, and I remember fixing my tennis shoes with a needle and thread. For whatever reason, I just remember using my own mental capabilities to figure things out. A fun example of when I really had to figure things out on my own, without a book of instructions or any special tool, was when I was working at my after-school job of cleaning a fishing boat after it had returned from a full day of fishing. It was my responsibility to clean the smelly boat with a brush, and one day I realized that a pelican got stuck upside down in the bait tank, and I looked at the pelican, and I realized that before the boss returned, I had to remove this pelican from the bait tank. This is a California brown pelican. This is a creature that I had to clean. So without any known remove the pelican from bait tank app, I figured out the best way to remove the pelican was to find a net and build a contraption that would safely remove the pelican so I could finally go home. I remember removing the pelican without hurting it and without me getting hurt, and I felt good that I figured it out all by myself. And this is partly why I've been so attracted to the 18th century, this age of reason, the Enlightenment, using the mental capacity to figure things out. In my youth, I also remember projects and challenges that involved creativity and curiosity and the need to fix and resolve issues. So I think one of the main reasons why I was attracted to the Spanish Enlightenment was my affinity to an intellectual movement that celebrated the capacity to use science, math, and problem-solving skills. Now, I was no inventor, and I was no genius, but it was empowering to use the intellect to solve problems without a manual, an app, or book of instructions. For me, the Enlightenment seemed to explore these same experiences. The Spanish Enlightenment is a period in which we learn about pioneers of the intellectual capacity to find solutions and seek better ways for the human experience. In my opinion, the Spanish Enlightenment is not only a celebration of achievements of the human intellect, but it is also a period that connects well with today's society in that self-reliance, independence, and confidence in one's intellectual ability can be the path to positive self-esteem and empowerment. So, why do I spend my time thinking about the Spanish Enlightenment? It's because the Enlightenment is about self-discovery, self-reliance, and creating a path to happiness. So last week, I had this little talk all ready to go. For the first time, I was a step ahead of the game. Everything seemed to be in order. And I was thinking, what could possibly go wrong? Well, just this past Monday, after browsing the headlines in a major Spanish newspaper, it hit me that I needed to revise this talk a little bit. Just 3 days ago, major Spanish newspapers announced that this week, the Royal Academy of History and Spanish Ministry of Education are both recommending that public high school Spanish history courses would no longer cover material prior to 1812 as historical modules. That is, high school history courses could now start at 1812, with brief mention of prior events as examples of economic, social, and religious events. And I thought, yes, the 18th century would now really be the forgotten century. While one Spanish region, Murcia, is protesting, the Spanish Ministry of Education argues that basic historical knowledge after 1812 is sufficient for the development of historical knowledge of Spain. Surprisingly, this would mean that the prior public educational model, referred to as the Word Law, would be totally transformed, and public high school history courses would no longer include the study of Spain's encounter with the Americas, the history of Jews, Muslims, and Christians living in harmony, for example in Toledo, the medieval period, the Golden Age, and sadly, the Spanish Enlightenment. This proposed Lomloe plan, or more popularly known as the FELA reformative plan, would allow brief mention of certain examples of events prior to 1812, but only to demonstrate an economic topic, such as owning land in the medieval period, old guard monarchies to discuss social protest, or the Catholic Church to discuss religion. However, under this new proposed high school plan by the Spanish Ministry of Education and the Spanish Royal Academy of History, the development of ideology, intellectual development, philosophical trends, and the advancement of the humanities in celebrated periods such as the underrepresented 18th century would be virtually eliminated. The future generation of Spaniards would have even less awareness and knowledge of the intellectual accomplishments and progress attained during the 1700s in Spain. It would be like sweeping the Enlightenment under the rug. Now, why the changes to public high school curricula? The Spanish Ministry of Education argues that in history courses, it would serve students best not to include discussions about not-so-great moments in Spanish history, such as violence, sexism, patriarchy, abusive monarchies, the Inquisition, religious exile, etc., especially during the medieval period. The Ministry of Education argues this week that it would be too painful and polarizing for current students to cover these dark moments in Spanish history. As in the past, the forgotten century, the Spanish 18th century, will again be left abandoned, disregarded, underappreciated, misunderstood, and ignored. very familiar feelings for me as a specialist in Spain of the 1700s. In fact, when I arrived at Marquette in 1999, I recall a funny moment. I remember asking one of my new colleagues if any of our courses covered 18th century Spanish literature, and I remember being told, well, Scott, in one course we cover a couple of 18th century textual fragments, but we can get through it in about 2 weeks. And I remember how fast my heart started to race, my blood pressure quickly rising, and the difficulty I had in continuing to smile with my new colleague. Never forget it. No hard feelings now. I've moved on. Kind of. Now, I think we're in a better place now, but seriously, I love my colleagues and we all work well together. Still. Almost 2 decades ago, I started to use a great Spanish culture book published by a major editorial and written about 20 years ago by a very competent author educated in Spain. The immense text eloquently covers history, culture, and literature of Spain, and I'm very happy to share it with my students. In fact, it's one of my favorite books. Even though I absolutely love how the text flows, how it presents complicated issues, and how it selects the most representative text in Spanish history, there is one sentence that just boils my blood, and it's the first sentence that comes to mind whenever I see the book on my own desk. At the very beginning of the chapter dedicated to the 18th century, the author states, now, and this is my translation from Spanish to English. Now, you've probably never heard too much about the 18th century. In this century, there were no great authors. The 18th century is perceived as a mediocre and gray century with little interest. I cringe. My blood still boils when I read this. In reality, the 18th century, this is the most published image of 18th century Spain. It's very important if we want to better understand contemporary Spain. In other words, there's a direct correlation between understanding this movement and contemporary Spain. Now, while most of us already know about Spain's contributions to traditional cuisine, such as chorizo, jamón ibérico, sherry or jerez, the Spanish omelet, tortilla de patatas, hot chocolate, the lollipop or chupa chups, did you also know that 18th century Spain has contributed much more in regards to chemical discoveries, scientific inventions, and cultural contribution? Yes, there is much more to Spain than bullfighting, siestas, flamenco, Antonio Banderas, Fado stores, and Barcelona's tiki-taka soccer. For example, the rare metal tungsten, or wolfram, was a chemical element discovered by Spanish chemists in the 18th century. This is the chemical element W. The 18th century Spaniard Antonio de Ulloa discovered platinum, and during the same century, Maria Andrea Casamayor developed the first modern concept of internship called tirocinio. Many innovative discoveries and scientific accomplishments occurred in 18th century Spain. Yet historians and academics could do a much better job highlighting these important cultural and intellectual achievements. This innovative spirit and industrious activity during the Spanish Enlightenment is also mirrored in more contemporary inventions and discoveries in Spain, such as the modern submarine, the digital calculator, the telescope, the cable car, the classical guitar, the modern spacesuit, the wheelchair, the pencil sharpener, neuroscience, the stapler, and my favorite, the mop. All Spanish discoveries and inventions. And let's not forget that just 12 years ago, even in the state of Wisconsin, we have another example of Spanish ingenuity. The state of Wisconsin decided to spend millions of dollars to purchase reliable, Talgo trains, an innovative train system designed and built in Spain. Scott Walker later canceled the train project, but the fact that an American state selected a Spanish train mover for our transportation needs speaks to Spanish innovation and design even in contemporary times. Aside from its numerous scientific and technological innovations, the Spanish 18th century is also known as a liberal and intellectual movement with the goal of clarifying the idea of Spain with symbols and language. During the monarchical reign of the Bourbon family in Spain, many Spanish intellectuals during the Enlightenment strived to carve out a parallel Spanish identity. The question was, what exactly is Spain? An open-ended question that begged the next question, what are our symbols and what text certifies our language? In the innovative 18th century, the liberal intellectuals, the eruditos and hombres de bien, were responsible for the massive publication of the first Spanish dictionary by the Real Academia Española. This is the logo of the Royal Spanish Academy, and I'd like to point out something that's kind of funny to me. We have an image of fire, and this fire in 1739 represents the burning of all French words and to cleanse the Spanish language. Limpia, fija, y da esplendor, clean, fix, and give splendor. And of course we have the royal imagery on top with the cross on the top. For all you soccer fans, Real Madrid recently eliminated the Christian cross on the top of their logo to eliminate all reference to religion. So this is the academy that attempted to define what Spanishness is. This was a 14-year-old project called the Autoridades, the authoritative dictionary. It's still in publication today with new editions more or less every 7 or 8 years. It aimed to cleanse the Spanish language from all French influence. There was an intense desire to eliminate the influence of French words in the 18th century. As we know, in American English, we too often use French phrases like s'il vous plaît, bon appétit, rendezvous, déjà vu, etc. The first Spanish national anthem, the Himno Nacional, or national anthem, was adopted in the 18th century as well. This music was an attempt to mirror, musically, Spanishness within the diverse culture of the 1700s. Spain's national flag. This is the version from the 18th century, not the current flag. This flag was also adopted in 1785, and its designers attempted to create a visual symbol of Spanish identity, culture, and values. And finally, the Academia de Buen Gusto, or loosely translated the Academy of Good Taste, which doesn't sound quite right, but that's the best I can do, was created in part to suggest to Spaniards just what Spanish was exactly. What made a Spaniard a Spaniard? The dictionary, music, the national flag, and the Good Taste Bureau, or the Academy of Good Taste, were all attempts to construct a national identity during the important 18th century. Now, about 25 years ago, before I arrived at Marquette, my dissertation advisor, who is now retired, said to me one Friday afternoon in Philadelphia, "Hey Scott, I'd like to give you a copy of a text written by a virtually unknown author named Francisco Gutierrez de los Rios, and the name of the text is El Hombre Práctico, written in 1680 and published outside of Spain in 1686 in Brussels. During the Inquisition, this text was prohibited way too scandalous. This collection of 61 essays was, until about 25 years ago, virtually unheard of, until my dissertation advisor found a first edition in a private library near Sevilla, Spain. The author, Gutierrez de los Rios, this is his full title. He was a count. Was the third count of a small town called Fernan Núñez. So Fernan Núñez is the name of the small town, not his name. And he spent his resources not on palaces, houses, or properties, but rather on his travels to places like France, England, and Germany, and the purchase of innovative books written in 18th century Europe. This is a common theme of all the most important 18th century Spanish writers. They invested in themselves, not in properties. They invested in traveling and learning languages. I tell many of my students that one important key to intellectual enrichment is proficiency in a second language or more. Learning languages opens doors to new ways of looking at the world and ourselves and reflecting on what all of this means. The author of the El Hombre Práctico writes an innovative philosophical text about the human intellect, mental capacity, and mankind's ability to look at our world scientifically and suggest practical solutions to everyday problems. And this is probably why I connect so well with this text. The ability of oneself to figure out progress and problem solving using our own mental capacity. In other words, Gutiérrez de los Rios can be considered now as perhaps the first Spanish Enlightenment writer because the Hombre Práctico essays suggest that answers regarding social progress, intellectual growth, and the betterment of the soul relies not on spiritual entities or institutions, but rather in the power of the mind, the ability to trust oneself and our ability to reflect and think using our five senses to explore new roads towards social progress. Of course, during the Spanish Inquisition, which continued throughout the 18th century, the Hombre Práctico text was strictly prohibited in Spain, and for that reason, it was published outside Spain's borders. The first essay of the collection of El Hombre Práctico focuses on the importance of parents in the development of child education. The author suggests that social progress in Spain depends not on the state or the church, but rather on the role of a liberal-minded and educated parent who should take the responsibility to educate their offspring. This text is innovative in 18th century Spain because the idea of parents participating in the liberal education of their children was unheard of at that time. Although published at the very end of the 17th century, we can really classify this text intellectually, philosophically, as probably the first Enlightenment essay collection in Spain. The long 18th century, not necessarily chronologically by numbers. Today, an electronic copy, a very high quality PDF of this original book of essays is accessible to the general public. I'm so enthusiastic about this 16K text. Just looking at the titles of the 61 essays shows us what our author was thinking about at the beginning of the Enlightenment. Some of the topics explored in this book of essays include, and this is just a partial selection, include the capacity of the intellect, family responsibility, pedagogy, physical exercise, importance of learning languages, medicine, fear, virtue, career paths, hobbies, knowledge, passion, courtesy, uncertainty, fidelity, truth, happiness, marriage, conversation, false appearances, and of course, death. The essays, written by Gutiérrez Rios, covers most of our big questions in life. The most interesting ones to me personally as a specialist in the 18th century include the idea of the unknown, uncertainty, curiosity, creativity, pragmatism, and the human capacity to find solutions. All of these themes in this Enlightenment text remind me of why I'm so moved by the humanities even today. We, today, are celebrating the humanities at this event, and this book of essays reminds us of why the humanities are so important. Texts like this allow us to reflect on the big questions. That is, they allow us to reflect on so many doubts that we might have about what all of this means. The essay about happiness, towards the end of the essay collection, is very interesting to me, and I think students would love reading about this topic, especially in today's world. A large part of the essay on happiness focuses on how relying on trusting our intellect and reaching ideals in accomplishing goals can help us with issues of self-esteem and happiness. While this essay, number 55, about the concept of happiness suggests that self-reliance, self-independence, and self-discovery are key to achieving happiness, ultimate happiness cannot be achieved without considering the eternity of life after death. Otherwise, the author claims, the human experience would resemble a boat at sea without a rudder. So we are reminded that these essays, while focusing on the development of the human intellect, also recognize a certain spirituality, eternity, and afterlife. This text has been in print for just over 25 years in an accessible format, and hopefully El Hombre Practico will become more of a staple in the curriculum of 18th century Spanish literature. And to continue with my previous corny analogy, if the Hombre Practico text had an Instagram page, I think it would have now over 1 million followers. Another essay worth mentioning in this Hombre Practico text is essay number 53, which is entitled Patria, or loosely translated, Homeland. This essay suggests that any person striving to understand themselves and their identity, as well as their intellectual capacity, should learn languages and travel to other countries. The ability to speak another language, just one foreign language, and the experience of knowing other cultures empowers a person to not only understand how other people communicate and how other people live, but this knowledge and these experiences also allow us to better understand who we are and in which culture we exist. Knowing the other helps us know ourselves, and these reflections in the essays of Gutierrez de los Rios demonstrates his modernity and his appreciation of humanities. Our multilingual author reminds us of the other pivotal authors of 18th century Spain who later became pioneers in 18th century Enlightenment thought. Other multilingual and well-traveled authors after Gutierrez de los Rios include José de Cadalso, Ignacio de Luzán, and Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos, and many others, but this is the list of all-stars. The key idea here is that knowing the other is a gateway not only to knowing our diverse world, but also a way to develop human intellect and our own identity. Another 18th century Spanish writer worth mentioning today is the monk Benito Jerónimo Feijó, not Feijó, Feijó, as some might mispronounce his name, who in 1739 published a book of essays entitled Teatro Crítico Universal, or Universal Critical Theater, which is a misleading title because it's actually a book of essays. It's not a book of theater. One of the essays in this 18th century text is a study of the intellectual capacity, not of men, but more specifically about women. The essay, now we have to remember this text was written in the very early 18th century. This essay is entitled Defense of Women, Defensa de las Mujeres. And to my knowledge, it may be the first philosophical text in 18th century Spain that argues that the intellectual capacity of women is equal, if not superior, to men's. We're talking about a monk in 18th century Spain. Feijó argues that while Spain is a culture dominated by a patriarchal society and sexist values, women have the intellectual capacity to serve in more challenging roles. The most surprising aspect of this 1739 essay collection is that this monk of the northern part of Spain, called Asturias, writes in a very conservative society and attempts to challenge popular thought and conventional perspectives of the intellectual capacity of Spanish women, and all women for that matter. The 18th century Enlightenment Spain, then, is surprising to many readers, or its forefathers, because we can also find innovative arguments regarding the sexes and the concept of gender equality in a very conservative and patriarchal culture. Feijó reminds me of why I have such an affinity for the Spanish Enlightenment. We can now locate writers previously overlooked who demonstrate the capacity to see beyond conventional thought of that time. And in the field of 18th century Spanish theater, the author, it's a little blurry, sorry. The author, Leandro Fernández Moratín, publishes a play called El Sí de las Niñas, which challenges the fact that Spanish women during the 18th century had little or no say in their marriage options. This Enlightenment author, like Feijó, argues for women's rights at a time when the Inquisition conditioned popular culture, values, and thought. I think it's the photo. Sorry. The Enlightenment in Spain was a time when liberal thought began to break down conventional cultural barriers. But perhaps the real rock star of 18th century Spanish literature is my hero, José de Cadalso, a dynamic and insightful poet, novelist, essay, and military figure who for the first time in the 18th century challenged readers to rethink how we perceive reality and everyday experiences. Cadalso, who was a privileged young writer, decided to take advantage of his family resources and traveled abroad to other European countries, studied English, Latin, French, purchased innovative European texts during the Enlightenment, and thankfully, for all of us, had also shared new philosophical trends within fictitious and entertaining literary contexts. He was the first to share these innovative Enlightenment ideas with Spanish readers in a popular format. For example, the epistolary novel. One adventurous book that Cadalso purchased in his travels was Oliver Goldsmith's Citizen of the World, a fictitious epistolary novel about the benefits of travel, languages, and experiencing new cultures and questioning perceptions of reality. In his 1774 epistolary novel entitled The Moroccan Letters, or Cartas Marruecas, Cadalso imagines a fictitious world in which his three characters exchange letters about their individual perceptions of 18th century Spanish culture. In this novel, each of the three letter writers offer their impressions of the same reality. In other words, it's like if three people were describing an apple from three different perspectives. The apple has a different look from each perspective. We, the readers, must pick up the pieces, organize the letters, and act as detectives, and form our own opinion of what Spanish culture must really be like. Three characters, three perspectives, and the reader must put it together just like a puzzle. This innovative novelistic structure mimics the chaotic world in which we all live. Rarely do we see an introduction, a body, and a clear ending in our own real-life experiences. Many times, we enter environments with little or piecemeal knowledge, and we must form our own opinion based on information and data that we may or may not have. Cadalso also creates a text that mirrors reality. Cadalso is truly an Enlightenment writer, an innovative novelist that questions linearity and conventional novelistic structure to mimic what reality is really like. Cadalso, the superstar of Enlightenment literature in Spain, does give credit to Miguel de Cervantes, the true pioneer of the modern European novel. So Cadalso doesn't pretend to be the greatest Spanish novelist, but he does suggest that his novel is even more of an accurate mirroring of human experience as we know it. Like our other authors mentioned today, Cadalso benefits from a knowledge of languages, cultures, science, and Enlightenment philosophy. He used his resources, again, to invest in himself and his personal growth, not in material growth. He produces a more innovative and accurate depiction of human experiences. While the main characters in Don Quixote disagree on what those windmills really are, Cadalso's characters even struggle to trust the words to clearly depict what they see. In Cadalso's text, language is questioned. One character in particular, Nuño Núñez, which is an exaggeration of typical Spanish names, even struggles to find the words to express his own frustration. Cadalso seems to suggest that even language is slippery and questionable as symbols of communication. Many times in English we say, you know what I mean. Well, maybe not. words fail. And Cadalso seems to depict this concept already in the 18th century. Cadalso is perhaps the most advanced Enlightenment thinker in Spain because language, the vehicle for crystallizing thought, is questioned as a reliable vehicle to express thought. So on that note, I hope these words were a reliable vehicle to express how innovative this Spanish Enlightenment really is. Thank you very much for listening.